Thank you, Anna. And thank you to all the organizers and my colleagues for inviting me to share a global perspective on what we call financial capability. And I think definitions and language vary from country to country. In our circumstance, we refer to financial capability in many ways as an aspirational state where a client is ultimately empowered to behave in a more responsible way, to accumulate assets, to have an economic security blanket. So that's, for today, you can consider financial capability and financial education and financial literacy to be all one phrase. But I really want to emphasize three key points today. We've had a wonderful set of presentations and discussions from the context here in Russia, where I think there's great leadership over the past few years in focusing on the value of financial education. Obviously, the work that Florent and our colleagues are doing at OECD to look at the global perspective and helping national governments think about this. To a degree, I'm going to talk a bit more about that perspective blending with providers, where this middle ground is. How do we have national frameworks, national policies, and how do we work in an aligned way with providers to actually implement them? In our experience, we spend more time making grant investments with our partners who are implementing programs, not setting national policies. So I want to talk a bit about that, and I hope the clicker works. Oh, actually worked too well. Again, if you can remember three things from this presentation, this is the slide you should pay attention to. After this slide, you can go back to your BlackBerries or your iPhones or your Droids or whatever technology that we use here. Fundamentally, I think we all have discussed today, and we would agree, and you'll be hearing over the rest of the day, that client empowerment or financial capability really is a critical element of economic security and ultimately responsible finance. You can put certain recourse mechanisms in place and client protection and elements on right products and whatnot, but a client that knows or a consumer that knows what's best for them is a safeguard. And if you have an entire population, particularly starting with young people, who know what's best for them and what their needs are, I think ultimately you'll benefit in the long run. I do want to talk about, and I don't know if this translates into Russian, the concept of a North Star, a central point where we can focus between policy creation and regulation and also incentives for providers to act responsibly so that they're mitigating risk and actually realizing financial benefit. And I actually do believe that this is possible, being respectful of course, nefarious marketing that does occur, as we know. And to my last point, there is an opportunity. We see a lot of increasing evidence, and we'll talk about this in the next panel session, of products that have been designed and services that are being provided that will meet individual consumer needs, whether you're a pensioner or you're a young person emerging into the workplace, that benefit them, but that also can actually be sustainable to the provider. Because there's great risk of policies, recommendations, mandates that say providers have to do certain things, but there's no sustainable economic way to actually implement them. That the challenge lies in between. How do we ensure that the financial service providers can do this without bankrupting them, because ultimately many of them are businesses, yet how do we have them operate in a more responsible manner so that they meet the national mandates of these governments? So these are the three key points that I'll talk just a bit more about. I'm very impressed with all the progress that we've made. For many years, as Florent knows, many of us have been sort of shouting in the wilderness that this is really important, and I think the governments have been far ahead of providers in how valuable and necessary this information is and these approaches are. I think we actually are starting to see changes. We obviously have a tremendous amount of progress from a policy, regulatory standpoint, but we're also starting to see from a provider standpoint a lot of alignment, organization, coordination, and understanding of the value of this approach. Just a couple of key points that I'd like to point to focus on. Increasingly, I think, and I think Florent referenced this, as did some of the other speakers, some of these policies are actually adjusting a bit as we better understand outcomes. And I think that that's important as we think about, from national financial education strategies, what we thought about and what we're learning need to adjust and be calibrated against each other. And I think we're seeing more and more of an evidence-based approach to our policymaking and regulation. One of the things that we certainly understand and value is the two sides of the coin, so to speak, between client protection and financial education. And I think we have programs increasingly that work in tandem with one another. CGAP is doing more and more work in this regard. And I think what's exciting in many ways is that we have more and more evidence of what's working and what's not. We have more to do, but here's obviously a bit of a list of measurement, and there's some others that we've heard today, PISA being one. The Global Findex, for those of you not familiar, is a program of the World Bank, financial index measuring, I forget how 10 million, I forget how many people globally, but it's an astronomical number supported by the Gates Foundation and Gallup. Obviously, the work of the Russia Trust Fund and the UK government, DFID, has done some work in this regard in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have a program with one of our NGO partners, IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, to basically measure, to understand what's working and what's not. Because you can have policy, it may seem good at the surface, but if we don't know that it's benefiting anybody, what good is that policy? And so I think we're all recognizing the value of investing in that research and the gathering of evidence to make better policy, which in turn will have providers ultimately operating more responsibly and more effectively for their clients' benefit. And as you can see at the bottom, I really fundamentally think, and my colleagues at the Citi Foundation, and I think a lot of our partners see that we're really at a tipping point or an inflection point where providers and policymakers and regulators are starting to align. However, I think we have a little more work to do. We talked, Lauren mentioned all the work that OECD and INFI have done, as well as the Global Program for Financial Inclusion, G20. There's a tremendous amount of progress. Some countries are further ahead than others, but I think the general direction is uptake of these national strategies and the calibration and adjustment of those strategies. Very critical, because without that, there wouldn't be a framework from which we could all work. I think the challenge for many of the regulators and policymakers has been, who do we talk to on the other side of the table? We, as a body, or a series of different countries and organizations, can sit and talk to one another, but who do we talk to that's actually implementing these programs and providing these services? And an interesting emergence that's occurred over the past couple of years, and I think it's one example, certainly within the NGO community and the foundation community, is the Financial Inclusion 2020 program, which is basically a global effort to drive financial inclusion for all by 2020. And in this process, which was led by a variety of different NGO partners and researchers and others, there were 5 core elements that made up this program. And one of them, in fact, basically it's a framework for providers to move forward to achieve full financial inclusion. And I'll show you a bit more about this, but one of the breakthroughs, in my opinion, was actually the adoption of financial capability. We've talked a lot about access, and access alone actually doesn't really solve much. It actually probably creates more risk in many respects. With balance, we think we can actually have a more sustainable approach. And so I think the convergence of policy and regulation with providers operating in a more concentrated and coordinated fashion, we might actually have an opportunity to change. And what does this actually look like? I hope everybody, I think everybody can see on the screen, these are the 5 principles of the Financial Inclusion 2020 process. And again, this is a program that a group called Acción International, an NGO based in the United States but operating in many countries around the world, initially focused on microfinance, but now increasingly financial inclusion more broadly, helped to lead. But many people in this room and others were involved in this process. And I just want to point out this issue of balance. Access, demand, infrastructure is really critical to ensuring that financial services are provided in a responsible way, and in many ways, more importantly, adopted by individuals in an appropriate way. So if you see the 5 categories, obviously what pleased us a great deal at the Citi Foundation, and I'm sure everyone in this room, was financial literacy, or financial education, or financial capability is one of the core pillars. But we also have to get a better understanding of what clients actually need. And I'll get at this in a little bit in my presentation, because each individual needs different things at different times in their lives. And that's a very hard concept for providers and policymakers and regulators to create a structure around. What I need today may not be what I need 20 years from now. I certainly know it won't be what I need 20 years from now. But understanding that is really critical and helping design programs. Groups like CGAP and others are moving quite far forward on this. The role of technology, obviously increasingly, is relevant to all of this. We have to accept the fact that technology is increasingly the central platform for which financial services are going to be provided, if they're not already, especially where there's infrastructure that doesn't exist. Credit reporting, obviously increasingly necessary. It's part of the infrastructure discussion, and obviously we've talked a bit about client protection, the other side of the coin. I think what's encouraging for many of you in the room, and I hope for the policymakers and regulators, is that there is now a group on the other side of the table, so to speak, that they can talk to say, how do we work better together to achieve these objectives? So I come back to this language of the North Star, and hopefully our friend is translating, there's a Russian translation for this, but the central point from which we can all focus. There's been a lot of progress made, certainly at the policy-making level, particularly because of G20 and others, APEC. How do we create a dialogue between these policymakers and regulators and the providers, where there's an alignment of incentives? Obviously, there's a mandate for governments to protect and serve their citizens. And for financial service providers, there's a mandate to provide a quality service and a quality product, and yet still be a sustainable, viable institution as a company. How do we create incentives for providers who have an ability to mitigate risks, so not ensuring that their clients aren't over-indebted, but yet could provide products, increase savings account usage? There are opportunities, I think, to align the two. I think I've talked obviously about the account usage. What we don't necessarily know from a provider perspective yet, I think, are what are the targets, what are we exactly trying to achieve? And I think a lot of this comes in the measurement and the evidence side, and I think we'll see a bit more of this over the coming years. But having an understanding of where we need to go, what does that mean? What does success look like from a provider's perspective? How do we define balance? How do we define what works and what doesn't? Client protection, are there recourse mechanisms in place? Is that a measure of success? I'm not sure yet, but I think we need to get more understanding in that regard. Or is it savings balances in savings accounts? I think there's an argument to be made there's too much savings in certain economies, and other economies not any savings at all. Or are insurance products a measure of success for a provider? More insurance products purchased, more insurance policies taken out, does that mean clients are more financially empowered? I don't know, and this is part of what I hope happens over today is a discussion around these measures of success. We also have to recognize that from a global perspective, as we know, and really in each country, there are different needs for different people at different times. And the challenge, of course, for providers and also policymakers and regulators is how do you create a framework that addresses everybody's needs at those different points. And the challenge is, you could look at a place like Asia, for instance, where you have fundamental issues of access to financial products and services. But also you have very advanced economies with aging populations that need better benefits and knowledge around pensions and insurance. And as governments and providers, particularly providers that work across markets, how do you address that from a business profile, business model? It's a big challenge, and I think we have a lot more to learn. And then fundamentally, I think we have to talk a bit about, and we'll learn in this next session, about evidence. How does evidence influence and inform not only national policies, but also how providers operate, how providers act? This is a really, I think, fantastic schematic, which I wish I could claim credit for. I thought a lot about it, but our colleague Elizabeth Ryan, who works at the Center for Financial Inclusion at Axiom, put this together. And it references my comment earlier about everybody needs a different product or service at a different time in their lives. And I think, as you can see, going from left to right, and we're talking obviously about young people today, what they need is very different than what they need as a middle-aged adult with a young family, obviously maybe starting or trying to run a business, starting to think about saving for the future. In a lot of the economies that I'm familiar with, there are no guaranteed schemes for retirement. Increasingly not, which is a challenge. How do you save enough? How do you protect your family as we get older? And obviously, the more that we become mature and older and wiser, I'd like to believe,
We have different needs at that particular time. But as a provider, and I think you can create policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks around this reasonably well, but as a provider, how do you develop products and services that meet this framework in an economically viable way? It's an enormous challenge. And so what I think we see a lot of are what I would say are monolithic products that are a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's an enormous challenge because it doesn't necessarily meet individuals' financial needs, particularly as they change over time. So what I really want you to remember about this framework is that it's pretty complex. And I'd actually argue that it's, in many ways, three-dimensional. But it gives you a sense of, and if you were to think about an arc of your experience that goes through this process, how do you design financial products and services as a provider that can help evolve over the course of your life? And it's very challenging, but I'm hopeful that we can. Because despite all of these changes and the population changing dramatically, I fundamentally think that there will be more access, as I talked about the role of technology, increasingly more and more the ubiquity of technology, the provision of financial services through that technology will fundamentally reduce the cost of the provision of this service. So the ability to think in a more customized way is actually, I believe, more feasible as time goes on. I think we're still a long ways away from that. I think you're starting to see integration of products, services across sector, across industry, where health and education and financial services are in many ways packaged as one. We're seeing this in certain economies more than others, but ultimately I think we're going to see more of that. Ultimately, it's about platforms in many ways. And what's I think really exciting and a bit scary is the role of technology to collect data and how we behave. And how do we operate as rational or irrational human beings? And we'll hear a bit more about this next, but I think the role of what we call big data and understanding human behavior and patterns will really help to influence and inform providers in a cost-effective way so that they can develop products and services that are economically viable and yet responsive. And I believe that's the end of my presentation, so thank you very much.